Yeah, in today's workshop, we're going to be discussing the various structures and piles that are commonly used at community composting sites here in New York City. By having an understanding of what type of system available to you, you'll be able to assess what is best for your compost site. So again, my name is Kyleen Sanchez from the Lower East Side Ecology Center. I also have Jimmie Costello here with me today.
Hey everyone, this is Jimmie Costello. I am also an outreach coordinator at the Lower East Side Ecology Center. Very happy to be here. We have a really special guest, Nando Rodriguez. Maybe you already know him. I feel like he is a powerhouse in Uptown Manhattan. No exaggeration when I say that. I feel like everyone on the street knows who he is, at least when I was with him. Let's see if we can spotlight Nando, or just if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nando Rodriguez. I am a longtime gardener, longtime garden designer, longtime composter, born and raised in New York City, in the Lower East Side, New York. Now my focus is West Harlem. But yeah, I'm here to get my information and answer some questions.
Thank you, Nando. Thank you, Jimmie. Excited for all of us to be here today. Let's get right into it because we have a lot to cover by sharing the workshop agenda with you. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to start off with introducing the New York City Compost Project and the Lower East Side Ecology Center. Jimmie and I come from both. Then we're going to head into composting basics so that we're all on the same page. We might see some beginners here, so we want to ensure that the terms that we're going to be talking about today, we can all fully understand. And then we're going to move on to the big chunk of our presentation today, which is discussing community composting systems. And we're definitely going to be highlighting Nando's excellent compost system from the 90s, still up today. And then lastly, we're going to open the floor up to discussion and questions. And we'll try to do our best to save at least 10 minutes for that. So I'm passing it off to Jimmie. He's going to get started on discussing who the Lower East Side Ecology Center is.
Perfect. All right, so the Ecology Center, we are a small environmental nonprofit, and we have essentially 4 main program areas. The first one is composting. So we are a New York City Compost Project host site, and so I have this fancy new shirt I'm so happy to be wearing today. We are one of 7 Compost Project host sites. I also see, quick shout out to Chelsea and Kavavian. I think she's on the call. She is calling in from the Queens Botanic Garden. She does a lot of the similar work that we do. So we're a compost project host site, and we have a compost operation. Our second one is environmental education. So in the picture, you see one of our previous staff. He is working with, these were children from a charter school, but we do workshops and classes. These can be either public or private, so they can be for a specific group like a school or with some kind of like train the trainer type program, or they can just be for the general public. We also do e-waste collection. So generally speaking, what that looks like for us right now is we host these kind of fun pop-up events all throughout the city, as far out as like Elmhurst and Queens, or even more centralized like in the Lower East Side, Tompkins Square. We actually just set up our calendar for the spring and early summer. So if you're interested, reach out. And then the last program area that we'll highlight today is our stewardship program. So as you see in the photo, this is from the East River Park. We invite New Yorkers to care for the green spaces that they normally would just be enjoying. Now they can care for them in a more responsible and sustainable way. So a little bit more about our compost program specifically and the New York City Compost Project. Just jump to the next slide. Perfect. So there are 4 kind of main categories or tasks that I'll highlight today. The first is that, of course, we bring composting opportunities and we give New Yorkers the opportunity to compost within their city. So our goal here is to make composting more accessible to all New Yorkers. And as of current, you can see this map on the right-hand side. We have over 200 FSDOs, which stands for Food Scrap Drop-Off Opportunities. So these might run for 2 hours once a week, or they might run 24/7. Similarly, we have local processing sites. The Ecology Center is currently in between 2 sites, so we are not processing at the moment, but within a few months, we will be processing our material again. And essentially, the intention here is for all of the food scraps that are collected to not only be collected, but also to be hauled, processed, and for that finished, beautiful, useful compost to be applied within the same city. So there's no hauling to these faraway landfills or things of that nature. Similarly, outreach and education, that's what we're doing right now, getting the good word out, giving people the more technical information so that they can get excited and maybe start composting themselves. And then the last is we offer technical support. So let's say you watch this webinar, you're so excited, you email me, Jimmie, I want to be an FSDO. I want to start composting in my backyard. We can offer you, maybe we can give you a bin build where we help you to build your compost system. We can help you to get connected with volunteers because we know that it's never a one-person operation, or we can provide you with tools that will make your life a little bit easier. So those are the things that we do as a New York City Compost Project host site. And now we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty, some of the definitions of what compost is.
Thank you, Jimmie, for introducing us. So let's go into composting basics, composting 101. We're gonna discuss what composting is, what that process looks like, and how that relates to our topic today. So let's go right into it. Let's talk about what is composting? What is compost and all the similar terms. You're gonna be, once you start your compost program, you're gonna be seeing some different definitions, and it's good to understand what those are and how to explain it to folks here in New York City. So let's start identifying with the first one, decomposition. We've all seen this happen naturally, whether that be in a forest or an urban park like Central Park. Decomposition even happens in your own home. Maybe you left your banana out on your countertop. It's essentially decomposing over time. When we as humans enter the picture of decomposition, we manage that process, and that process is called composting. And composting is different because we as humans, we're the managers. We are creating an ideal environment where microorganisms like decomposers can thrive, survive, and even multiply as a colony. When we do this successfully, the organic matter will actually decompose at a much, much faster rate than it would in the wild. So we're trying to get that finished product faster so that we can use it. And that finished product is called compost. So this is our end goal. We want to create compost so that we can reuse it into our green spaces. So compost is a natural and nutrient-rich soil amendment made from essentially free materials, right? We don't have to go out and purchase compost. We can make it ourselves. So as gardeners, as composters, instead of tossing out your garden clippings or even the food that didn't make it into our stomachs, we can give these food scraps and organic matter another life by composting it. So what does this process actually look like? Well, I'm going to give you pretty much a simplified version of it. This compost process can look like many things depending on your site, your size, the people that are working on it. But essentially, like I said before, composting happens when organic matter, such as your food scraps, your kitchen scraps, your garden waste, they're decomposed in a human managed process. When we're thinking about composting in an urban setting, a lot of folks say, well, I can't do that. There's a lot of factors that won't let me do it. Well, as composters, we're not only creating a thriving environment for our microorganisms, but it's our job to ensure that this process is safe for our workers, so those that are doing the composting, but also we're considering factors for our neighbors close by. You know, we're in New York, we're in such tight communities. You want to be respectful to our neighbors so that our composting process is successful and that it is inviting. So a couple of things you have to think about in the composting process. We like to categorize them into 5 important factors. Again, there are more than 5, but these are the 5 to get started. So let's go into the first one, which is maybe the obvious one, which is our feedstocks. Our feedstocks can be considered as our ingredients for composting. So what exactly, as gardeners, what do you want to compost? Your feedstocks are consistent of greens, which is your wet material, like your food scraps, and then your browns, which are your dry materials, such as wood chips and leaves. So this is very big categories, but they can be simplified even further. But essentially, you will need your greens and your browns. Next two factors to consider are moisture and oxygen levels. Just like us as humans, we need water and air to survive, and these are really important factors for our microorganisms to thrive. So we need to answer the questions such as how wet should our compost be, or how many air pockets should we have? The way that we can control these levels is to think about your feedstocks in the first place and the rest of the three factors too. The fourth factor is the size of your ingredients. So a lot of folks may not typically think about this in the first place, but the size of your ingredients definitely dictates how quickly or slowly your materials will decompose in the first place. So for example, an entire watermelon as a whole will decompose a lot slower than it would be if it was into smaller pieces. And then lastly, what we're going to be talking about today is the size and shape of your system. Not only do you have to think about your moisture, oxygen, and the amount and size of your feedstock, but also where will your system be placed in the first place, right? Where in your garden or your backyard will you be putting your system? Can it fit in a small garden? Do you plan on eventually growing your compost program and you would like to size up in the future? So these are just things that we all consider, and I would like you to take away that you're a combination of all five factors. There's no one type you should follow. We as composters, we do experiment with different levels, different feedstocks. So it is really tailored to you, but all of these factors are interconnected in some way and can definitely influence one another. So let's get right into talking about these systems, an exciting part. I'm going to pass it off to Jimmie.
Well, all right, so now this is where we will be spending most of our time for today. This is the real walkthrough of all the community compost systems. There are more than this, and there's always someone making up some new version. So we just picked kind of some of the most popular ones, or the ones that we see most often throughout NYC. So the very first one is going to be a wire bin. So this is pretty simple. On the left, we have a picture of the bin. It seems like it's probably like 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, which is a common metric. This is referred to as 1 cubic yard. So you'll see this throughout we're going to reference 1 cubic yard often throughout the presentation. You'll see that the bin is just simple wire. It's probably made using hardware cloth. We recommend using galvanized, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And you'll see that this is just a simple bin, and it's elevated onto a wooden pallet by a few inches. And then on the right-hand side, this is a photo from Harlem Grown, which is of course in Harlem. And they have a similar system where they have a few bins, they're all elevated, and they also went ahead and built this kind of very simple structure that only includes a top, and that might help to prevent some rain from entering the system. So some of the pros of working with a simple wire bin, the first is that it's very low commitment. So we put this in the beginning, kind of one of the most simple systems. It's very, very easy to construct. Really, you just take your hardware cloth, wrap it into a circle, and at the end of the day, that's all you want to do, then that's your bin. We definitely recommend to elevate it by a few inches or even like a foot or so if you can, but it's not necessary. That being said, it's also super cheap. Really, at the end of the day, you only need one material in order to make this system happen. And something else that's really great about working with a wire bin is that it's modular, meaning that it can easily be taken apart, can easily be reused into something else. So for example, if you get into composting this spring, you're working with your wire bin, it's going great, but come fall, your volunteers are dropping like flies, maybe you're not so interested, you have a different job, you can kind of take that material and reuse it for something else. So it's very easy to take it apart. It's very easy to move. For example, if you decide that you actually want to set up your bins in a different order, or if you want to move to a different side of your community garden. So it's very modular. It's easy to move it around, or easy to repurpose it if you decide that you're not actually going to be composting right now. That being said, because it is such a simple system, it's also, you'll see that it's very much exposed. On the top, it generally doesn't have a lid. I encourage you to put a lid on if you want to get a little bit more advanced, but at the most basic level, it doesn't include any kind of lid. And even if you do have one with hardware cloth, it's going to be very much exposed to your climate. So let's say, for example, if you're having a dry spell, or if you're having a lot of rain, your compost is going to show that. So there's no kind of buffer between the climate that you're making in your compost system and the climate outside. They're kind of going to end up being the same thing. That being said, this is definitely a weakness of this system, is that it might be easy for a pest such as we see generally possums and rats. Those are the most common. A climbing pest might be able to enter the top very easily. We're going to talk a lot about pests and pest prevention. That is also a whole other presentation in itself, but we'll try and drop some wisdom throughout. So you'll see on the slide, I call out that we recommend composting in batches when you're working with wire bins. So there are two reasons for that. The first is that when you're working with a wire bin, using a batch will get the composting process started more rapidly. So for example, if you were to add a little bit of food scraps, one apple core, one banana peel a day, the process would start very slowly. All of the activity, all of the life, all of the heat that makes composting happen wouldn't happen as fast. So that's one benefit of using it composting in batches. And then the other one is that we highly recommend, and it's applicable to all of the systems, but in particular for wire bins, to add browns to the top of your system so that that will also deter pests. So this acts kind of like a blanket, and I'll talk more about capping at the end. But capping your system using a layer of browns, which is kind of built into composting in batches, will help there to be a higher temperature, and B, not as many pests. So that's essentially that on the wire bin. Now let's take one step up to something that's a little bit more involved, but still very much in the DIY world, which is going to be a fabricated bin. It can be either metal, plastic, I guess it could be something else as well. So this bin, this slide, you can kind of think of this as like the DIY time. So obviously the pros of doing a DIY is that's probably going to be pretty low cost. So for example, you might even be able to upcycle. I've seen people who they have a garbage can that's like good enough for composting, but it's not really good enough to be used for garbage anymore, and you wouldn't want to put it out for someone to pick it up. So this is a really great way, if you have material that's already kind of lying around, to give it a second life. That being said, another pro is that it also provides kind of a moderate level of aeration. So for example, the wire bin, it's very much exposed, and some of the other systems that we'll talk about are very tightly sealed. These bins, they are kind of somewhere in the middle where they have some oxygen, some air holes. It's not much, but they're somewhat protected. Another great pro of working with a bin like this is that they're very easy to move. So for example, the bin on the right, it might even have wheels in the back, making it perfect to lug it around if you want to put it in the sun to help it warm up, or if you want to just move it to a different garden, bring it home one day, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, there's always ups and downs. So one thing that we want to call out in particular when you're working with the metal cans that you see on the left, these ones are pictured from La Plaza Cultural Center, which is in the East Village. We highly recommend, and this applies to any metal that you're working with when composting, if you can, we always recommend that you work with galvanized steel. It's not 100% necessary, but it is safer in terms of preventing some of the toxic things that are present in metal from going into your compost. So again, it's not 100% necessary, but if you can afford it, if you have it on hand, we highly recommend it. So another thing that we'll call out, just a best management practice, is that if you are working with galvanized steel, maybe you have some hardware cloth, I highly recommend kind of lining the holes with some type of hardware cloth, maybe the one that's 1/4 of an inch, which is slightly finer. That would, again, just prevent any smaller pests from entering the holes. All right, so another con of working with these bins, and I have a video to display, is that sometimes they're a little bit awkward to get to the bottom. So let's say, for example, you've been composting for a couple of months, your material's getting nice and warm, you're really happy, everything's going great. It's now time to harvest, or maybe you want to turn your material. It can be a little bit difficult to do so. So I have a video that I'm going to show that explains or kind of displays what it's like to turn a bin such as this one. So you'll see they're going to use a pitchfork. They are starting a new compost bin here, and they're trying to mix all of their material thoroughly. But I just feel like the best word for it is that it's a little bit awkward. It's definitely doable. At the end of the day, it totally does work, but I feel like it's a little bit difficult sometimes. And you can imagine that if you have your finished compost and you're ready to harvest, it might be difficult to kind of differentiate the two from your fresh material. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, perfect. And the last thing that I will call out about these bins is that if your system is running wet, you might end up with leachate at the bottom. Leachate is essentially a very strong kind of liquid runoff, you might think of it as, from composting. And again, because these systems are a little bit hard to access the bottom, you might end up with some excess liquid at the bottom of your bin. So that being said, the next one that Kyleen will highlight has the exact kind of design features to fight against that.
Thank you, Jimmie. So if you want to go maybe like a step up, find something that is in your budget, something that's maybe more aesthetically pleasing, there are commercially available plastic bins out there, and they're designed in a way to make the composting process easier. So these bins are made from durable, weatherproof plastic. They're good protection against rodents and pests. And they are easily accessible for their short height and can be a good choice for those that have smaller spaces. So again, these guys have 3 kind of openings to them that again makes the composting process easier. First of all, it has a removable lid at the top that can make a better way of adding your feedstocks and be able to turn your compost. There's also a door right in the front, as you can see from the the plastic bins on the right. There is a door on the bottom where you can actually harvest your finished material. And then lastly, you can't really see it in the picture, but the bottom of the bin is actually bare. So there's no bottom. And the reason for that, and Jimmie said this before, is that there can be sitting wet material because this is an enclosed system. It doesn't have as much access to air as maybe the wire bin had. So you might come across having to add more browns so that you can introduce more air pockets and for those browns to soak in that moisture. But in doing so, you'll have to also add browns underneath just in case you do have that wet material. But if you're following your best practices, you'll be less likely to be at risk for that. So Jimmie is going to share quickly on a video of what that kind of looks like inside. I know it's hard to visually think of that in your mind, but this is essentially what an inside of your commercial available bin would look like. This one, I think, is the soil saver. Is that what that's called, Jimmie? The soil saver. But you can find a lot of manufactured bins out there. I'm going to share my screen again so we can go back. But some things that you want to keep in mind with these types of bins is that a lot of manufacturers may recommend only composting certain materials for a specific type of bin. So for example, we have the Garden Gourmet on the right. The manufacturer recommends that you only use it for garden waste as opposed to food scraps. So if you're looking for something that's on the market, just ensure that you are putting the correct material. You're choosing the right feedstocks to go in there. Another commercially available system are called tumblers. So these guys are actually quite popular, especially in an urban setting. Tumblers are essentially in-vessel or enclosed systems, typically lifted off the ground to allow for the vessel to turn and mix the materials inside. So most likely you won't have to take out your feedstocks, your compost out of the vessel. You can turn it right in there. As Jimmie had mentioned before, a lot of folks have trouble turning their materials in the first place. So tumblers definitely make it easier to do that. Tumblers also come in either single or multi-chamber options, which is awesome. Like I said before, if you are interested in expanding your compost program and you want to take in a little bit more material, having another chamber is an awesome way to do that. So I think these types of enclosed systems are popular among gardeners who have smaller spaces, those that are concerned with pests and rodents. These types of systems are durable, they're weather resistant plastic, they can be lifted on the ground, and they can be easily relocated. There's a lot of advantages to it if you are concerned with rodents or like a space issue. And just like our other systems that we've already mentioned, you also may encounter some issues with the system. So you'll want to address those quickly to have a successful composting process. So first of all, like I said before, it's completely enclosed. So compost can get wet very easily. And when that compost is wet, it slows down the decomposition process. So some things we recommend is either opening the chambers up, allowing for more airflow, and again, adding more dry materials. Dry materials are a godsend. You always want to keep a lot on hand. So this is, again, your wood chips or your sawdust or leaves, and this helps soak in that excess moisture and even add more airspace. And then secondly, these tumblers can pose an accessibility issue. So this can be quite difficult for children or elderly adults to use. And even these larger chambers, once they get full, they can actually become a little bit too heavy for one person to move. So if you're by yourself, maybe that's something that you'll have to consider in the future, is the difficulty in even turning the bin in the first place. So think about who will be helping you compost your food scraps and how will they also be able to use their system. And then the next system that we're going to be talking about is not plastic. We're going to move on to a different material, and that is lumber, or you can use reclaimed wood. So we see these a lot in community composting sites because wooden bins are essentially very durable. They're also very functional, and they're aesthetically pleasing. They're nice to look at. So these wooden bins can be made from either reclaimed wood, so these are typically free or very affordable options, or they can be made with new lumber, so lumber that you can essentially buy. Reclaimed wood often come in the form of pallets. A lot of folks like to use pallets because they're already constructed walls. You don't have to do it yourself. A lot of pallets are usually either oak or southern yellow pine, which is two options, very good for composting. But something that you'll have to consider is if you're looking to adopt a pallet or grab already used lumber, is you don't necessarily know what it has been used for before. It could have been left out in the rain. It could have been treated with different chemicals. So just keep in mind, you'll have to go through those extra steps to ensure that the material that you're going to be using is actually safe and something that you want to be used for composting. If you want to avoid those issues, you can also purchase new lumber where you'll have full control of your material of choice. But again, it is more expensive these days, especially with outdoor dining. A lot of what we found is that good lumber is hard to come by. But if you do grab some new lumber, you'll be able to fully design your system in the way you want it to, as opposed to coming with an already predetermined design. So what kind of considerations should you have when you're actually building these bins? Well, first is that you always want to build these in, again, like Jimmie said before, in 1 cubic yard at the minimum for your volume. And this is important for your compost mixture, your compost pile, to build up its heat and have the food scraps decompose even rapidly. You should also consider lining the inside of your bin with hardware cloth, an ongoing trend, but this will help deter pests. And then also, before you even build your wooden bin, you want to ensure that your ground is leveled. You don't want it to rock back and forth or essentially be knocked over. So make sure that it's leveled off. And then lastly, when we're talking about accessibility, it's really nice to have at least one of the sides removable. On the picture on the left, those wooden slats in the front can actually be removed, so it's easier to go in there and mix up your material. And even the cover, you can lift it off as well. So moving on, if you are composting a large amount of material, you can have more than one system. You can have more than one bin. And Jimmie will go over one of the more popular ones out there.
Alrighty, yes. So kind of the go-to system for many community gardens who are really into composting is a 3-bin system. Now, pause, technically speaking, you could also just have 2 bins or 4. 3 has just kind of been set as this magic number for a lot of community gardens. But please know that if you want to stick with 1, or if you want to go with 2 before you get to 3, or if you have 3 and you want to go to 4 or 5, it doesn't have to be technically built in sets of 3. This is just kind of, again, this magic number that people have landed on. And so let's talk a little bit about the 3-bin system in particular. The biggest pro that I hope is kind of clear is that you have 3 bins. Who would have thunk it? That being said, kind of the pro that's built in there is that you can have multiple ages of compost at multiple points throughout its life. So let's say, for example, we have pictured here a 3-bin system. What a common community compost operation might look like is on the right-hand side, on the far right bay, you might have finished compost, which is cured, which means that it's old, it's kind of aged like a fine wine, and it's ready to be used. It's highly applicable. You can use it in your garden, or you can give it to your friends and family. Then in the middle bay, you might have an active compost system, which means that your greens and your browns are currently very hot, or they're heating up. They are actually breaking down the material. It shouldn't really be touched too much other than to turn it. This is not ready to be used, but it's kind of at the key point in its life. And then maybe, for example, finishing up this story or common narrative, we would have on the left-hand side, that bay might be accepting new materials. So people would be dropping off their food scraps, their greens, and you might be adding new browns. So for example, people are putting in their banana peels, their apple cores, whatever food scraps you have, you might be accepting, or you as the community composter might be adding in leaves, other brown materials like wood chips or wood shavings. So that's kind of a good example of how someone might be using the 3-bin system at any one point in time. That being said, I also kind of the best management practice, or the little green star that we're shouting at here, you don't always have to be doing active composting or using all 3 bays for composting in that sense. So for example, a very, very common pitfall that we see for people who are excited about composting, they watch a webinar like this, or they learn about it online. They are passionate and driven to divert their food scraps from landfill, which is obviously fantastic, and we love their energy. However, maybe they're posting a bunch of flyers around town, they're telling all their friends and family, people are giving them all this food scraps, and they actually don't have adequate brown material, things like leaves or woody material that you harvest from your garden, to kind of create that nice ratio. So the option that you can have to solve that issue, and where a 3-bin system comes into play, is even if you're actually only composting in 1 or 2 of your kind of segments or your sections, you can use 1 or 2 of these just as storage. So for example, you can store your finished compost, or you can store a large supply of browns. And I always recommend, if someone offers you a bunch of leaves, you might not know when you're going to use it, but as a community composter, they are actually sometimes more difficult to get your hands on than you might realize, and B, a lot more useful than you might have thought previously. So you could even just, rather than using using all 3 of these for active composting, you can have 2 of them for composting, and 1 of them is just essentially used as storage with a bunch of leaves or a bunch of wood shavings. Another thing that I'll call out, similar to the single bins that Kyleen referenced earlier, if you are building a 3-bin system, or if someone's building one for you, if you're buying one, I highly recommend designing it such that this front part with all of those wooden slats, such that those can be disassembled so that you can easily access your materials. So let's say you want to turn it around with a pitchfork, or if you're ready to harvest and your material has aged and you're ready to use it, it's a lot easier if you can take that front part off so you can grab from the bottom. It's easier for older people. It's not as awkward. It's just generally a better system. So I recommend that. And of course, all composting systems have their pros and their cons. So some of the issues that you might run into if you are working with a 3-bin system, the first is that you're going to need a fair set of hands. So it definitely requires more human power than some of the other smaller operations. There's no set number. Generally speaking, I would say somewhere between 3 and 5 people who are volunteering regularly might be good. And again, it's a larger system, so you're going to have to concretize or set up, make sure you have a firm stream of browns. So that might look like you making sure that you're very specific about harvesting your leaves, or it might look like you reaching out to a wood shop that's near you or some other local business to make sure that you have a regular supply, sustainable supply of browns. So, all right, that is the 3-bin system. Again, it's kind of a classic. Once you start looking for it, you'll actually see it all throughout the city. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about something. Again, we started with the most basic, and now we're getting slightly more and more advanced, and we're definitely getting towards the end here. What we're going to talk about is aeration. So how can you introduce that fresh oxygen, which Kyleen referenced in the beginning as being one of the 5 key factors? How can you do that on a more regular basis? So a term that you might see as you graduate into higher compost terminology is an ASP, an aerated static pile. So let's break it down. Let's try to make it a little bit, I know it sounds kind of like jargon or scientific. So aerated, this means that oxygen is regularly introduced to the system. So all of the previous systems that we referenced, they use human power to turn and aerate their system. They introduce oxygen sometimes, but an ASP, an aerated static pile, it's introducing oxygen much more regularly. For example, it might be introducing oxygen 24/7, or it might be doing that, every 30 minutes. Similarly, we're talking about it's static. So what does that mean in composting? It means that the pile is not turned. It means that the pile is not disrupted. So the pile can actually sit without being churned or turned regularly. So ASPs, again, they use design to aerate their compost, whereas all of the previous systems that we referenced, a bin, a tumbler, they require someone to turn that tumbler or to get the pitchfork and to actually turn it physically using human power, versus an ASP uses its design to lessen the human input. So let's play the video. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long. It features Nando talking about his proprietary system, which is the hot box.
Nando Rodriguez. Welcome to Frank White Memorial Garden. I am here to introduce to you the hot box composting system.
All right, so tell me a little bit about the history of the system.
So this composting system was designed and created back in 1990s with Open Road Park in the Lower East Side. And I was a teenager back then, with 9 other people helping to design the system. We went through a series of different experimental material until we found one that works. We have discovered a cubic yard volume, which helps to get the temperatures above 120 on a regular basis. What we also have discovered is that this compost bin reaches to 180 degrees, which makes this compost bin thermophilic. What makes this hot box so special and different than other hot box is we don't have to turn our compost. So this system uses 6 PVCs, where in the PVCs there are drilled holes throughout the whole PVC pipes. Then we enter the PVCs in the bottom and in the middle, so that when the heat is rising and the compost bin is looking for more oxygen, heat rises and pulls in the cold, fresh air, which gives the compost oxygen. We begin to mix our composts in containers similar to this one, where we put the volumes that we're all used to knowing, 50-50, 40-60 of green and carbon, right? So green and browns, nitrogen and carbon, food waste, and your dried waste from your yard waste. We mix it up well, put it in here, and then we dump it and leave it for about 2 to 2.5 months. After those 2.5 to 3 months, or 2 months, we take it out and we sift it in our design sifter reuse recycled material.
So who would you recommend the hot box system for?
These hot boxes are best for urban cities, small community gardens, large community gardens, If you're a small garden and you take in a little bit of food waste from your community, start with 1 bin. If you are a large garden and you take a lot of volume of food waste in your community, then you can extend your compost bins to 4. Instead of having multiple bins where you have to turn it and turn one into the other, we don't turn them, we leave them here. So now you can have a whole nother system working 2 months later while this one is cooking. And when this one is ready to be sifted and taken out, this one will be halfway. You can start a new system and take out this one. So these 4 bins for us gives us the capability to work all year round composting without any pause.
Cool. All right,
That's why in the urban city, the hot box composting system best works for people like us, city gardeners, urban farmers. Nice to have you. Come back and visit us.
Awesome. Okay, cool. I hope that that played well, and I hope that the audio was good for everyone. Nando, I'll give you, we're doing pretty well on time. Why don't we give you like 1 or 2 minutes to just talk a little bit more about the system? In particular, if you want to talk about, I know one of the bins there has been around since 1998, so that's a really great thing to call out.
Yeah, I was in the midst of saying that. Like the last bin that you guys saw in that video is the bin that I created when I was a teenager. That's, pretty much almost 30 years old. When you think about using plastic and metal and wood, and I'm not knocking it, whatever system works for you, definitely use the system that works for you in your composting garden. And if you're not composting, definitely get a system that works for you. You don't have to have the hot box, but do compost. It's very important to add value to our garden. But that one system, it's been there for 30 years, and now we have 4 systems that we don't have to pretty much build anymore. And I've had everybody use it, because the amount of processing what you're doing is based on your own energy, and you don't have to use your energy again and again to come back and turn them. Your energy towards food waste and processing with these bins is only in the mixture in the beginning. You chop them, put the browns in, whatever comes in, you're pouring it in. Whatever comes in, you're pouring it in. Whatever comes in, you're pouring it in. When that system builds that compost bin is filled, then you open to the next one. If you don't get to the fill it all the way and your season's going, then you have that one system. The other beauty about this one that is not mentioned in the video is that the first layer that we put in is a pretty wide 6 inches of wood chip. When your compost, as Jimmie was saying, has leachate, that leachate is sucked up by the wood chip. Now, if you wanted to use the wood chip in, as a infused nutritional part for anything else, you can use that. But leachate is also very damaging and dangerous to have just leaking around. So having the bottom part of it be absorbed by the wood chip is a formula that we have used that has also been tested by Cornell University in Green Cities back in 2000. And they tested the whole site and they said, this is one of the systems that really works. And they compared it to bigger systems. So we're compared to a bigger system that we can pretty much take a lot of volumes.
Awesome. So let's just jump to the Q&A now. We have a slide that just says audience questions. So I don't know if we want to just like spotlight the speaker. And thank you again, Nando, for joining us. Thank you for letting me come to Frank White Memorial Garden up in Harlem to record the video. We've got a lot of, I see many questions in the chat. So I know someone is going to be feeding them to us. Let's get that part started. And then we just have like 1 or 2 other things that we can follow up with at the very end, just resources for people going forward.
Hi, yeah, so I'm going to be helping with the Q&A. My name is Vanessa, and there are a lot of questions for you all. And so I'm going to try to pick some of the ones that were repeats. I guess one of the questions was, while using metal bins, do you suggest using multiple bins to allow for full decomposition of one bin while adding new, fresh, compostable goods to another?
Sure, I can answer this one. It really depends where you're at in your compost journey. So if you're new and you're just getting started and you only want to dedicate yourself or only kind of want to set the goal of 1 bin, that's fine. It can be a little bit awkward. That's the word that I always use when talking about some of those more simple bins. And as someone that used one for a while, when it's finished, and I see someone ask that question, so I'm going to answer 2 at 1. How can you tell that it's ready to be harvested? It smells good. It smells earthy, like a forest, and you pick it up, and it has the moisture level of a wrung out sponge. So you might be able to get a little bit of water out of it, but it sticks into a ball. Also, if you have more questions about this, the Master Composter certificate we'll talk about in a second answers all of these things. So back to the bins, the metal bins, I would recommend having multiple if you can. It's not necessary, but it is ideal because then you can have things a little bit more separated and organized. So if you can afford it, I don't know what your budget is, or if you have a few laying around, it's always better to have more, whether it be for storage, curing, storing your food scraps before adding them to compost, et cetera, et cetera. So not necessary, but it is recommended if you can.
Thank you. And I think this question is for Nando. With his PVC pipe non-turn system, how is the compost removed? Are the pipes left in place or removed?
So when you're ready to remove your compost out of the hot box, the front of the box lifts up as light slabs. So you can take off the whole front as easy as lifting slabs, and then the PVC pipes just slide right out. So the whole front opens up, so you can get in there, even if you're unable to pick up your legs too high up, or if you want to have a kid go inside, they can scoop up each and every piece of that compost bin just by lifting up the slabs in the front.
Thank you. And I think a lot of people are also curious about how to get the details. So someone was asking if there were instructions to build the 3-bin system. Yeah.
You can reach me. You can reach me at Hotbox Composting System on Instagram. I think you can call GreenThumb. You can call Lower East Side Ecology Center. They have my phone number on call. I am more than welcome to come to your garden and talk to you about it, or invite you to our Frank White garden or wherever I have a Hotbox garden to talk to you about how to build it. I would like to come and build it for you because it's easier. It's better to have a perfect system prepared rather than you going through trouble and having to build it. I will build it for you, go through the first practices and construction and how to prepare your first batch. After that, we leave it up to you, but you'll always have my phone on call for any problems that may occur.
Thank you. And then there's just a general question. I think you all sort of answered it, but the general question about how to combat rodents. I don't know if it differs between the different systems.
And I know there was a couple of systems you guys can answer, but at least for the hot box, there was a question about the rodents, and I answered that. But there is a lid depending on your garden. Each garden can determine what type of lid they want, and the lid will be designed in a way that will not be easy for any rodents to lift up or take up. So it's rodent-proof entire bin from the bottom to the top, at least for the hot box.
Thank you, Nando. I also want to add that, like, for rodent pest control, especially our New York City rats or friends, the kind of like the first step that helped us is to understand rat activity, what they're like, what kind of conditions do they prefer. And New York City Health has an awesome Rat Academy course, even one specifically for community gardeners. So we have that in our resource guide that we're going to share with you after the workshop. But essentially, rats like tight, small spaces where they feel safe. So we always recommend for composting systems is to actually place them in a fairly high traffic area. So not necessarily the back corner of your garden that's where all your tools are, where all your leaves are, but it's not putting them somewhere where folks are constantly walking around. In addition to that, you also want your composting system to be exposed to all sides. So not necessarily pushing it against maybe a building wall or a fence, but having it exposed so that these rats aren't trying to find these small crevices to hide and to mate and to live. In addition to that too, is having your compost system propped off the ground, because rodents or rats, they like to burrow and they might be attracted to burrowing underneath your system. So having these systems just exposed to be moving, to be bothered, is kind of like the first step to go. So yeah, Jimmie, do you want to add anything to that?
Rat Academy, shout it out. We also, I'm not sure if it's in the, I put 2 documents in the chat. One of them is is links and resources specific to this presentation. It has my contact info, Kyleen's contact info, and Nando, of course, he's kind of the celebrity, his contact info. And it also has a bunch of useful links, Instagrams, other videos. And then I also put a simple guide that Kyleen made. Thank you, Kyleen. It's simple, but it's very, very effective, that describes the pros and cons and kind of summarizes everything that we put together today. So if you want to share this with your community garden, someone was asking about that, this would be a great kind of document to share with them if they don't want to watch the recording.
And then I'll ask one more general question. Do pesticides affect composting? This is for everyone.
I'll kick it off right now. I will say maybe the question is about like food grown, like using pesticide, or soil affected by pesticides during the composting process, especially when we're aiming for what Nando said earlier, is thermophilic temperatures, meaning that your compost pile is over at least 131 degrees in for a 14-day period. This allows for essentially these microorganisms to fight against these harmful bacteria and other chemicals. And after that process, where most of your materials are broken down, you want to go through a curing phase where another set of microorganisms will turn over and stabilize your compost. That being said, we don't always have a perfect experience. So often here at the Lower East Side Ecology Center, we actually have our compost tested to make sure that it is safe to use, especially those who want to use it for growing food. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Nothing to add. Thank you, Kyleen.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much, panelists. And thank you so much to Vanessa for skillfully handling all of the Q&A. Jimmie and Kyleen have generously offered to hang out in the GreenThumb GrowTogether conference Slack for a little bit. Jimmie made a whole new channel just for the composting Q&A. So please head over there. I'm putting a link in the chat right now. And so if you have more questions that weren't answered, I'm so sorry we didn't get to it during this session, but you can go join them there and keep talking about compost. We're really thrilled to have everyone today. Thank you so much for joining the conference.